The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the suburban neighborhood in a soft golden glow. The sound of children laughing and the occasional bark of a dog faded as the evening settled in. In the cozy two-story house at the end of the cul-de-sac, the Warren family was wrapping up another ordinary day. The house itself was unremarkable but warm. A white picket fence, a neatly trimmed lawn, and a porch swing that creaked in the wind. Inside, the soft hum of a dishwasher blended with the low murmur of a television from the living room. Elliot, the youngest member of the Warren family, sat cross-legged on the plush carpet of his bedroom. At just 8 years old, he had a boundless imagination and an insatiable curiosity that often got him into trouble. His favorite pastime was drawing, and his room reflected this passion. Sheets of colorful crayon drawings were taped to the walls, each one more vibrant and chaotic than the last. Dragons, superheroes, and alien landscapes covered every inch of available space, making his room a kaleidoscope of colors. This particular evening, Elliot was digging through the back of his closet, searching for his missing blue crayon. He had an idea for a drawing of a spaceship, but needed the perfect shade of blue for the sky. His small hands rummaged through the piles of toys, clothes, and forgotten treasures that had accumulated in the dark corners of his closet. As he reached further back, his fingers brushed against something unfamiliar. A small rectangular box covered in a thin layer of dust. Curiosity piqued. Elliot pulled the box out and sat cross-legged on the floor. It was old, the cardboard brittle and faded. The label had long since worn off, leaving no clue as to what it contained. With careful hands, he pried open the lid, revealing a set of crayons unlike any he'd ever seen. The colors were muted, almost dull, and the paper wrappers were yellowed with age. At the bottom of the box was a single piece of folded paper, its edges crinkled and slightly torn. Elliot unfolded the paper, revealing a drawing that made his breath catch in his throat. The artwork was crude, as if drawn by a child, but there was something unsettling about it. It depicted a family, a tall, thin man with hollow eyes, a woman with an unnervingly wide smile, and a small child whose face seemed twisted into a grimace. Their proportions were off, their limbs unnaturally long, and their fingers ending in sharp points. Beneath the figures, written in shaky, uneven letters, were the words, "We live in your walls." Elliot stared at the drawing, a chill creeping down his spine. He turned it over, half expecting to find more unsettling images, but the back was blank. The paper felt heavy in his hands, as if it carried the weight of something more than just crayon and paper. For a moment, he considered showing it to his parents, but he quickly dismissed the idea. They would probably just tell him it was some old doodle left behind by the previous owners. Shrugging off the unease, Elliot tucked the drawing back into the box and slid it under his bed. He told himself it was nothing, just a silly picture, and returned to his other crayons. But as he sat back down to finish his spaceship, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him. That night, as the house settled into silence, Elliot lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The glow-in-the-dark stars he had stuck there years ago seemed dimmer than usual, their light barely cutting through the darkness. He pulled the covers up to his chin, trying to ignore the faint creaks and groans of the house as it cooled in the night air. He had always been comforted by the familiar sounds, but tonight they seemed different, closer, more deliberate. A soft scratching noise came from the wall behind his bed. It was faint at first, like the scuttle of a mouse, but it grew louder, more persistent. Elliot held his breath, his small hands clutching the blanket tightly. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. "Probably just mice," Elliot whispered to himself, though the words did little to calm him. He rolled over, forcing his eyes shut, and eventually drifted into a fitful sleep. The next morning, the sunlight streaming through his window did little to chase away the lingering unease from the night before. Elliot decided to shake it off, chalking it up to his overactive imagination. After all, his parents were always saying he let his mind run wild. He spent the day at school doodling in the margins of his notebooks, but no matter what he drew, his thoughts kept drifting back to the strange family in the crayon drawing. When he returned home, Elliot found himself unable to resist the pull of the mysterious box under his bed. He slid it out, his heart pounding as he opened the lid once more. The drawing was still there, unchanged, but this time he noticed something he hadn't before: a small smudge of red crayon on the corner of the paper. It wasn't part of the original drawing, he was sure of it. It looked fresh, as if someone had added it recently. Elliot's pulse quickened. He grabbed the paper and examined it closely, but there was no other sign of tampering. Shaking his head, he decided it was time to stop obsessing over the silly thing. He stuffed the drawing back into the box and shoved it deep into his closet, determined to forget about it. But as the days turned into weeks, the strange occurrences began to pile up. More drawings started appearing around the house, on the back of a cereal box, tucked inside one of his father's books, and even taped to the underside of the kitchen table. Each one depicted the same eerie family, their hollow eyes seeming to follow Elliot wherever he went. The words, "We live in your walls," were always scrawled somewhere on the page, their jagged letters growing more frantic with each new discovery. Elliot tried to tell his parents, but they dismissed his concerns with tired smiles and reassurances. His father checked the walls for pests, finding nothing but dust and cobwebs. His mother suggested he was playing a prank on himself, though her tone hinted at growing unease. Elliot knew better. The family in the walls was real, and they were getting closer. The first sign that something was truly wrong came 2 nights after Elliot had stuffed the drawing into the back of his closet. The air in his bedroom felt different that evening, heavier somehow. The soft hum of the radiator seemed distant, muffled as if something unseen had wrapped the room in a thick blanket of silence. Elliot sat on his bed, doodling absent-mindedly in a sketch pad, but his usual excitement for drawing was dulled. His mind kept drifting to the strange family and the eerie words, "We live in your walls." Elliot shook his head and focused on his sketch. He was drawing a knight in shining armor battling a dragon. He loved creating bold, vivid scenes like this one, where heroes always triumphed over the monsters. Yet tonight, no matter how hard he tried, the dragon's face came out wrong. Its eyes were too hollow, its mouth twisted into a grimace that reminded him of the child in the drawing he'd found. Frustrated, he tossed the sketch pad onto the floor and flopped back onto his pillow. That was when he heard it. A faint scratching sound, like tiny claws raking against wood. It was coming from the wall behind his bed. Elliot froze, his heart pounding in his ears. He listened intently, barely breathing, as the noise grew louder. It moved along the wall, slow and deliberate, as though something was dragging itself just beyond the surface. "Just mice," Elliot whispered to himself, clutching his blanket tightly. His father had said that old houses like theirs were prone to pests. Maybe the mice had returned. That's all it was. But deep down, Elliot didn't believe it. The scratching stopped suddenly, replaced by silence so complete it was almost deafening. Elliot stayed perfectly still, straining to hear anything else. Then came the whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. A child's voice, high and lilting, like a nursery rhyme sung off-key. "Elliot," the voice called, drawing out the syllables of his name. "Come and play." Elliot's breath hitched, and he bolted upright, his eyes darting around the room. The voice came again, louder this time, and it sounded like it was coming from the walls. "Come and play with us." "No," Elliot muttered, shaking his head and squeezing his eyes shut. "I'm just imagining it. This isn't real." But when he opened his eyes, he thought he saw a shadow move in the corner of the room, a quick flicker of motion near the closet door. He dove under his covers, pulling them tightly around him as if they could shield him from whatever was out there. Eventually, the whispers stopped, and exhaustion claimed him. But even as he drifted into an uneasy sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The next morning, Elliot woke to find his sketch pad lying open on the floor. He picked it up, intending to finish his knight and dragon drawing, but when he turned to the page, his stomach twisted in fear. The dragon was gone. In its place was a new drawing, one he didn't remember making. It showed a family, the same strange family from the crayon drawing. The man, woman, and child were standing in front of what looked like a brick wall. Their hollow eyes stared out at him, and their sharp fingers seemed to press against the paper, as though they were trying to push through. Scrawled beneath them in shaky, uneven letters were the words, "We see you." Elliot dropped the sketch pad and scrambled backward, his heart racing. "Mom! Dad!" he shouted, running out of his room. He found his parents in the kitchen, sipping coffee and reading the morning paper. "There's something in the walls," he blurted out, tears welling in his eyes. His mother knelt down and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Elliot, sweetheart, we've talked about this. There's nothing in the walls. Your dad even checked for mice, remember?" "But it's not mice," Elliot insisted. It's something else. They're watching me." He hesitated, unsure if he should mention the drawing. Would they even believe him? His father sighed and folded the newspaper. "Elliot, I think you've been watching too many scary movies with Sophia. Your imagination is running wild. There's nothing in the walls, I promise." Elliot clenched his fists, frustration bubbling inside him. "You don't believe me," he shouted, storming back to his room and slamming the door. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew they wouldn't help. He was on his own. That night, the sounds returned, but they were louder and more insistent. The scratching came from different parts of the room. First the wall by his bed, then the ceiling, and finally the floor. It was as though whatever was inside the walls was circling him, closing in. Elliot pulled his blanket up to his chin and stared at the closet door, half expecting it to creak open. Then, as if on cue, the door slowly swung inward with a low groan. Elliot's breath caught in his throat as he stared into the darkness beyond. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, something small and round rolled out of the closet and stopped at the foot of his bed. It was one of his crayons, a red one, its wrapper torn and faded. Elliot couldn't move, couldn't scream. He just sat there, trembling, as the scratching started again. This time, it was coming from inside the closet. A faint giggle echoed from the darkness, followed by the soft patter of footsteps. He didn't sleep at all that night. The following day, Elliot's unease deepened. The house, which had always felt warm and safe, now seemed cold and uninviting. Shadows lingered in the corners longer than they should, and the air carried a faint, musty smell that reminded him of an old, forgotten attic. While his parents were at work, Elliot wandered the house, trying to convince himself that everything was normal. He ventured into the living room, where the afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, creating long beams of golden light. It felt safe here, away from the confines of his room. He plopped down on the couch and turned on the TV, hoping the noise would drown out his thoughts. As he flipped through channels, something caught his eye. On the far wall, just above the baseboard, was a small patch of crayon marks. Elliot frowned and got up to take a closer look. The marks were faint, almost like scribbles. But as he squinted, he realized they weren't random. They formed letters. "Help us." The words were written in a childish scrawl, the letters uneven and jagged. Elliot's heart pounded as he stepped back, his mind racing. How long had that been there? He glanced around the room, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching him. But he was alone, or so he thought. That evening, Elliot couldn't bring himself to eat dinner. He pushed his food around his plate, his appetite lost to the growing pit of fear in his stomach. His parents exchanged worried glances but didn't press him. After dinner, he retreated to his room, dreading what the night would bring. As the hours ticked by, Elliot lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He was too afraid to close his eyes, afraid of what might happen if he let his guard down. The house was eerily quiet, the usual nighttime creaks and groans replaced by an oppressive silence. Then, just as he was starting to think he might survive the night without incident, he heard it, the faint sound of breathing. It was coming from the walls, slow and rhythmic, as if someone were standing just on the other side, listening. "Go away," Elliot whispered, his voice barely audible. But the breathing didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, closer. And then, from the corner of the room, a voice whispered, "We see you, Elliot. We're waiting." This time, Elliot screamed. Elliot didn't sleep at all after the whispering incident. He sat upright in bed, his small frame trembling as he clutched a flashlight in one hand and a baseball bat in the other. His room felt alien now, every shadow a lurking threat, every creak a sinister signal. He'd never felt so helpless, but one thing became clear to him. Whatever was in the walls wasn't going away. He needed to understand what it was. The morning brought little comfort. The golden rays of sunlight filtering through the curtains seemed dimmer, unable to chase away the unease that had settled over the house. Elliot's parents noticed the dark circles under his eyes and his unusual silence at breakfast. His father suggested a trip to the park to cheer him up, but Elliot shook his head. He had a mission. After his parents left for work, Elliot called his older cousin Sophia. At 16, Sophia was Elliot's hero. She had an unshakable confidence and always seemed to know what to do. She was also one of the few people who didn't dismiss his fears as childish nonsense. When he told her about the strange drawings, the noises in the walls, and the whispers, she listened intently, her face a mix of curiosity and concern. "That's creepy," Sophia admitted after he finished. "But you're sure you're not just imagining it? I mean, it sounds like something out of a horror movie." "I'm not making it up," Elliot insisted, his voice cracking. "It's real, Sophia. You have to believe me." Sophia sighed and ruffled his hair. Okay, I believe you. But if something weird is going on, We'll figure it out. Let's start with the drawings. The first thing they did was go through the box Elliot had found in the closet. Sophia held up the original crayon drawing, examining it closely. Her expression darkened as she studied the strange family depicted on the page. "This is unsettling," she murmured. "It doesn't look like something a little kid would draw. It's too deliberate." "What do you mean?" Elliot asked, leaning over her shoulder. Sophia pointed to the details in the drawing, the way the man's hollow eyes seemed to follow them, the sharp angles of the figure's fingers, the unnatural proportions. "It's like whoever made this wanted it to look like a child's drawing, but it's too precise. Like they were trying to make it creepy on purpose." Elliot shuddered. "So what do we do?" Sophia tapped her chin thoughtfully. "We need to figure out where this came from. You said you found it in the closet, right? Maybe there's more stuff hidden in there." Together, they emptied the closet, pulling out old toys, clothes, and forgotten school projects. It was a chaotic mess, but near the back, Sophia spotted something odd, a loose panel in the wall. She knelt down and pried it open, revealing a narrow, dusty crawl space. Creepy crawl space in an old house? "Of course," she muttered, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Elliot peered over her shoulder. The crawl space was dark, and the air that wafted out smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. "What's in there?" he asked. Sophia pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam illuminated a small space filled with cobwebs and debris. Among the dust and dirt were more crayon drawings, scattered haphazardly on the floor. Sophia reached in and grabbed a handful, careful to avoid the spider webs. The drawings were similar to the first, depictions of the strange family with increasingly disturbing details. In one, the family stood in a field of flowers, their faces blank and featureless. In another, they loomed over a crib, their sharp fingers reaching for the sleeping baby inside. And then there was the last one, which showed the family standing inside what looked like the Warren house, their hollow eyes fixed on the viewer. Elliot's stomach churned. Why are there so many? Sophia shook her head, her face pale. I don't know, but I don't think we're dealing with mice. As the day went on, the cousins expanded their search, venturing into other parts of the house. In the attic, they found more evidence of something strange. A small pile of crayon fragments near the corner of the room, as if someone had been drawing there. On the wall nearby, faint scribbles were etched into the wood, too faded to read, but unmistakably deliberate. The basement was even worse. The air was colder down there, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally. As they descended the creaky wooden stairs, Elliot hesitated, gripping Sophia's hand tightly. It's just a basement, Sophia said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. Probably just old storage stuff. The basement was cluttered with boxes, old furniture, and forgotten knickknacks. But in the far corner, something caught their attention. A section of the wall covered in faint crayon marks. The drawings were crude and childlike, but they told a story, a series of events that seemed to escalate with each image. The first drawing showed a family moving into the house, their faces cheerful and bright. The second showed the same family sitting together, their faces now blank. The third showed the family standing in front of a wall, their eyes hollow and dark. And in the final drawing, the family was gone, replaced by the strange figures Elliot had seen in the original drawing. Sophia traced the marks with her fingers, her brow furrowed. This doesn't make any sense. Who would do this? And why? I don't think it's who, Elliot said quietly. I think it's them. Sophia turned to him, her eyes wide. You think the family in the drawings did this? Elliot nodded. I think they're the ones in the walls. The discoveries weighed heavily on the cousins, but the worst was yet to come. That evening, as they sat in Elliot's room, poring over the drawings and trying to piece together the mystery, the house seemed to come alive. The scratching noises started again, louder and more erratic than before. They came from every direction, the walls, the ceiling, even the floor. Sophia jumped to her feet, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Okay, that's it. We're telling your parents. They won't believe us, Elliot said, his voice trembling. They'll just say we're imagining things. Before Sophia could respond, the closet door creaked open, revealing the dark crawl space beyond. The air grew colder, and a faint giggle echoed from inside. Did you hear that? Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible. Elliot nodded, his eyes wide with fear. He took a step closer to Sophia, his small hand gripping her arm. The giggle came again, followed by a child's voice. Elliot, it sang, the tone playful yet menacing. We're so glad you found us. Sophia's phone light flickered, then went out, plunging the room into darkness. Elliot whimpered, clutching her arm tighter. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, and then the voice spoke again, louder this time. Come and play. Sophia grabbed Elliot's hand and bolted for the door, dragging him out of the room and down the hallway. They didn't stop running until they were outside, the cold night air biting at their skin. Only then did they dare to look back at the house, its windows dark and unwelcoming. What do we do now? Elliot asked, his voice shaking. Sophia stared at the house, her mind racing. We figure out what they want, and then we end this. The house loomed behind them, its dark windows reflecting the cold moonlight. Elliot and Sophia stood on the front lawn, catching their breath in the crisp night air. Neither spoke for a moment, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. Finally, Sophia broke the silence. We can't keep running from this, she said, her voice shaky but resolute. We need to figure out what this family is, and why they're here. Elliot nodded, though his heart hammered in his chest. But how? What if they hurt us? They haven't hurt us yet, Sophia said, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. They've been trying to scare us, yes, but if they wanted to do more, they probably would have by now. I think they want something. We just need to figure out what. The next morning, after a restless few hours of sleep, Sophia returned to Elliot's house armed with a backpack full of supplies, flashlights, a notebook, a small hammer, and her laptop. We're going to do this properly, she said, as she marched into the living room. If we're dealing with ghosts, we need evidence. Elliot hesitated, clutching the edge of the couch. What if we make them angry? Sophia knelt in front of him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. We'll be careful, okay? Besides, we can't just leave this alone. They're not going to go away on their own. Reluctantly, Elliot agreed, and the two of them began their investigation in earnest. Sophia decided to start with the crawl space in Elliot's closet, where they had found the first batch of drawings. Sophia pulled the loose panel away, revealing the narrow, dark passage. She handed Elliot a flashlight and shone her own into the opening. The beam illuminated the dusty floorboards and cobweb-covered corners. At first, there didn't seem to be anything new, but as they crawled deeper inside, Sophia spotted something tucked into the far corner. An old, weathered journal. "Look at this," she whispered, brushing away the dust and flipping it open. The pages were brittle and yellowed. The ink faded but still legible. The entries were written in a hurried, scrawling hand. The journal belonged to a woman named Abigail, who had lived in the house decades earlier. The first few entries were mundane, describing her life with her husband and young son. But as the entries continued, they grew darker. October 3rd. Strange noises last night. Henry says it's just the house settling, but it sounded like whispers. Jacob heard it too. He said it was a little boy calling his name. October 15th. The noises are worse. I found Jacob drawing strange pictures today. He said the family in the walls taught him how. He's never spoken like this before. He's always been such a sweet boy. I don't understand what's happening to him. October 31st. Henry doesn't believe me, but I know what I saw. I saw them. They were standing in the hallway watching me. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. Their eyes, hollow, empty. They want Jacob. They want us. The final entry was the most chilling. November 5th. I'm writing this from the attic. They're in the house. Henry is gone. Jacob. Oh God, Jacob. I don't know what to do. If anyone finds this, please, burn the drawings. It's the only way to stop them. Sophia closed the journal, her hands trembling. They've been here before, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. This family. They've been haunting this house for years. But why? Elliot asked, his eyes wide. What do they want? Sophia shook her head. I don't know, but it sounds like they're connected to the drawings somehow. If Abigail was right, destroying them might weaken their hold on the house. Their next stop was the basement, where the faint crayon drawings on the wall had unnerved them the night before. Armed with the knowledge from Abigail's journal, Sophia studied the drawings more carefully this time. She noticed something she hadn't before. Hidden within the chaotic lines were faint symbols, almost like runes or sigils. These aren't just random scribbles, Sophia said, pointing to one of the symbols. They're deliberate, like some kind of spell or curse. Do you think the family made them? Elliot asked, his voice trembling. Sophia nodded. Maybe. Or maybe they were already here, and the family was drawn to them. Either way, these symbols seem important. They began searching the rest of the house, looking for more symbols or hidden drawings. In the attic, they found another cluster of crayon marks, this time accompanied by an old, tattered doll. The doll's face was smudged with red crayon, giving it the appearance of a sinister grin. Sophia picked it up cautiously, examining it. This might belong to them, she said. It could be a way to communicate with them, or maybe even a way to stop them. Elliot stared at the doll, a sinking feeling in his stomach. What if it makes them angry? Sophia sighed. It's a risk, but we don't have much of a choice. That night, Sophia stayed over at Elliot's house. The two of them set up camp in the living room, surrounded by their tools and the journal. They stayed up late, poring over the entries and discussing their next move. As the clock struck midnight, the temperature in the room plummeted. Do you feel that? Sophia whispered, her breath visible in the icy air. Elliot nodded, his eyes darting around the room. The shadows seemed to shift and stretch, moving unnaturally. Then, from the walls, came the familiar scratching sound. They're here, Sophia said, her voice shaking. She grabbed her flashlight and pointed it at the nearest wall. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, a figure began to emerge from the shadows. It was the child from the drawing, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Its head tilted to one side as it stared at them, its expression a mixture of curiosity and malice. Behind it, the tall, thin man and the wide, grinning woman appeared, their movements jerky and unnatural. Sophia held up the doll. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. The child giggled, a high-pitched, eerie sound. "We want to play," it said. "Come play with us, Sophia. Come play with us, Elliot." "No!" Elliot shouted, his fear giving way to anger. "Leave us alone!" The figures didn't move, but the room grew colder and the air filled with the sound of whispers. Sophia flipped through the journal frantically, searching for anything that could help. Her eyes landed on Abigail's final plea. "Burn the drawings." "The drawings!" she shouted. "We have to destroy them." Elliot and Sophia ran to the crawl space, grabbing the stack of crayon drawings they had found earlier. They carried them to the fireplace, their hands shaking as they lit a match. As the first drawing caught fire, the figures in the room let out a piercing scream. The sound was otherworldly, like nails on a chalkboard mixed with the wails of a dying animal. The flames consumed the drawings one by one, and with each one, the figures grew fainter, their hollow eyes dimming. By the time the last drawing turned to ash, the room was silent. The oppressive cold lifted, replaced by an eerie stillness. "Did we do it?" Elliot asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophia nodded, though her expression remained cautious. "I think so. For now." The next morning, the house felt different, warmer, lighter, as if a heavy weight had been lifted. But as Elliot and Sophia packed up their tools and prepared to leave, they noticed something strange. On the wall near the fireplace, where the drawings had been burned, was a new crayon mark. It was faint but unmistakable. A single word, scrawled in jagged letters. "Stay." The cousins exchanged a worried glance. The family in the walls might have been quieted, but something told them this wasn't over. The morning after Elliot and Sophia burned the drawings, the house felt oddly quiet. The oppressive chill had lifted, and for the first time in weeks, Elliot felt a flicker of hope that the nightmare might be over. But that hope was short-lived. At breakfast, Elliot tried to tell his parents about everything that had happened. He sat at the table, nervously clutching his glass of orange juice as he recounted the whispers, the drawings, and the terrifying figures in the walls. His parents exchanged skeptical glances, their expressions hovering between concern and disbelief. "Elliot, honey, you've always had such a vivid imagination," his mother said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "But ghosts? Families living in the walls? Don't you think that's a little far-fetched?" "It's not my imagination," Elliot exclaimed, his voice rising. "Sophia saw them too. We found their drawings and we burned them. That's why it feels different today." His father sighed and set down his coffee mug. "Elliot, I know you believe what you're saying, but this sounds like something you dreamed up. Maybe you've been watching too many scary movies with Sophia." "It wasn't a dream," Elliot yelled, his frustration boiling over. "Why don't you ever believe me?" "Elliot, that's enough," his father said firmly. "We're not going to entertain this any further. You're scaring yourself for no reason." Sophia, who had spent the night at the Warrens' house, entered the kitchen just as Elliot stormed out, his small feet pounding up the stairs. She frowned as she watched him go, then turned to face Elliot's parents. "He's not making it up, you know," she said, her voice steady but serious. "I saw it too. The drawings, the whispers. There's something wrong with this house." Elliot's father pinched the bridge of his nose. "Sophia, I appreciate you looking out for Elliot, but you're both letting your imaginations run wild. This house is over 50 years old. Any noises you've heard are probably just the building settling or pests." Sophia opened her mouth to argue, but decided against it. She knew they wouldn't listen, not until they experienced it themselves. That night, Elliot stayed in his room, refusing to come down for dinner. His parents decided to leave him alone, hoping he would calm down by morning. But as the house settled into its usual nighttime stillness, strange things began to happen. Elliot's mother was the first to notice it. She was in the kitchen, washing the last of the dinner dishes, when the sound of soft footsteps echoed from the hallway. At first, she assumed it was Elliot sneaking downstairs, but when she turned, no one was there. "Elliot?" she called, drying her hands on a dish towel. "Is that you?" There was no response, only silence. She frowned, her eyes scanning the empty hallway. As she turned back to the sink, she caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of her eye. A shadow flickered across the far wall, disappearing as quickly as it appeared. "Probably just my imagination," she muttered to herself, shaking her head. But her unease lingered. Meanwhile, Elliot's father was in his study, catching up on some paperwork. The room was quiet, save for the soft scratching of his pen against paper. Suddenly, he heard a faint tapping noise, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the wall behind him. He froze, his pen hovering mid-air. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. He turned in his chair, staring at the wall. "What the—" He leaned closer, pressing his ear against the plaster. The tapping stopped. For a moment, he thought it was over, but then a voice whispered through the wall, low and raspy. "We're still here." When Elliot's parents compared notes the next morning, their skepticism began to crack. His mother confessed to hearing footsteps and seeing shadows, while his father described the tapping and the eerie whisper. Neither wanted to admit they were scared, but their unease was palpable. "Maybe there's something to what Elliot and Sophia are saying," his mother ventured hesitantly. "What if it's not just their imagination?" His father shook his head, though his expression was uncertain. "It doesn't make sense. There's no such thing as ghosts." "Then what do you think is causing this?" she pressed. "The footsteps, the shadows, the voices? Are you really going to tell me it's just the house settling?" Before he could respond, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. Both parents bolted out of their chairs and ran to Elliot's room. They found him sitting on his bed, pale and trembling, staring at his closet. The door was wide open, and the contents of the top shelf, a pile of old toys and boxes, were scattered across the floor. "What happened?" his father demanded. Elliot pointed a shaky finger at the closet. "They were in there," he whispered. "I saw them." "Who?" his mother asked, kneeling beside him. "The family," Elliot said, his voice barely audible. "They were standing in the closet, watching me. Then the shelf just fell." Elliot's father stepped into the closet, examining the shelf. It didn't look loose, and there was no reason for it to collapse on its own. For the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt in his own reasoning. That evening, Sophia suggested they all stay in the living room together. "If the family in the walls is real," she said, "maybe they'll show themselves when we're all together." Elliot's parents reluctantly agreed, though the tension in the air was thick. They set up blankets and pillows on the couch and floor, the flickering light of the fireplace casting long shadows across the room. For a while, nothing happened. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the occasional creak of the old house. Just as Elliot's father was beginning to relax, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. "Do you feel that?" Elliot's mother whispered, pulling her blanket tighter around her. Before anyone could respond, the scratching started. It came from the walls, slow and deliberate, moving in a circle around the room. Then came the whispers, faint but unmistakable. "Elliot, we're still here." Elliot's father shot to his feet, his face pale. "What is that?" The shadows in the corners of the room began to shift and stretch, taking on humanoid shapes. The family emerged slowly from the walls, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. They didn't speak, but their presence was overwhelming. Elliot's mother clutched his arm, her breath coming in short gasps. "What do they want?" she whispered. Sophia, trembling but determined, stepped forward. "They want us to know they're here. They've been trying to scare us, but I think they want more than that." The figures moved closer, their forms flickering like static. The child giggled, a high-pitched, eerie sound that sent shivers down everyone's spine. The tall man raised a bony hand, pointing at the family. His mouth opened, revealing sharp, jagged teeth, and he spoke in a voice that sounded like grinding metal. "Leave, or join us." The experience left Elliot's parents shaken to their core. For the first time, they couldn't dismiss what was happening as imagination or coincidence. That night, they gathered in the kitchen, debating their next move. "We can't stay here," Elliot's mother said, her voice trembling. "It's not safe." "But where would we go?" his father asked. "This is our home." "It's not a home anymore," Sophia interjected. "Not while they're here." Elliot's parents looked at each other, the weight of the situation sinking in. They had no choice but to confront the truth. The family in the walls was real, and they weren't going to leave quietly. Elliot's parents barely slept that night. The living room, once a place of comfort and warmth, now felt like a battlefield. The encounter with the strange family had shattered their perception of reality, leaving them tense and exhausted. But it wasn't just fear keeping them awake. It was a gnawing sense of responsibility. They couldn't simply abandon their home, not without answers. By morning, the Warren family gathered at the kitchen table. Elliot sat quietly, poking at his cereal, while Sophia studied the journal they had found in the crawl space. Elliot's mother sipped her coffee, her hands trembling slightly, while his father leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "We can't keep living like this," Elliot's mother finally said, her voice unsteady. "We need to figure out what's happening in this house." Sophia nodded. "The journal said something about burning the drawings, but I don't think that's enough. There's more to this. Something in the walls. We need to find it." Elliot's father frowned. "And how do you propose we do that? Tear the house apart?" "If we have to," Sophia replied, her tone resolute. "We need to know what's behind all of this." They started with the attic, where they had found the crayon fragments and faint scribbles on the walls. Armed with flashlights, they combed through the cluttered space, moving old boxes and furniture aside. The air was thick with dust, and every step on the creaky floorboards sent a shiver down Elliot's spine. Sophia was the first to notice something unusual. "Over here," she called, pointing to a section of the wall near the far corner. It looked different from the rest, slightly discolored, as if it had been patched up hastily. Elliot's father examined it closely. "It's hollow," he said after tapping the surface. "There's definitely something behind here." Without hesitation, he grabbed a crowbar from the toolbox they had brought and began prying at the plaster. The wall gave way with a loud crack, revealing a hidden cavity. Inside was a small wooden box, its surface scratched and weathered. Sophia picked it up carefully, her hands trembling. The box was locked, but the latch was old and rusted. A few firm taps with the crowbar broke it open, revealing its contents. More crayon drawings, a bundle of yellowed letters, and a photograph. Elliot leaned in, his curiosity overcoming his fear. The photograph showed a family, a man, a woman, and a young boy. They were smiling, but their eyes had a hollow, lifeless quality that sent chills down his spine. "That's them," he whispered. "That's the family." Sophia unfolded one of the letters, her eyes scanning the faded handwriting. "These were written by Abigail," she said, referring to the woman from the journal. "Listen to this." The first letter read, "Dear Henry, I don't know how much longer we can stay here. The noises are getting worse, and Jacob won't stop talking about the family and the walls. He says they visit him at night, that they want him to join them. I'm so scared. Please come home soon." The second letter was more frantic. "Henry, they've taken Jacob. I don't know how, but he's gone. The house feels alive, like it's breathing. I hear them all the time now, whispering my name, laughing. I tried to leave, but the doors wouldn't open. It's like the house won't let me go." The final letter was barely legible, the handwriting shaky and uneven. "They're inside me now. I can feel them crawling under my skin. If you find this, please forgive me. I couldn't save him. I couldn't save myself." Sophia's voice broke as she finished reading, the weight of Abigail's despair sinking into the room. "She didn't make it," she said softly. "None of them did." Elliot's mother covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. What kind of nightmare did these people go through? Determined to uncover more, the family turned their attention to the basement. The air grew colder as they descended the creaky stairs, the faint smell of mildew and decay growing stronger. The basement had always been an unsettling place, but now it felt outright sinister. Sophia led the way, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The symbols they had noticed earlier were still etched into the walls, but now they seemed to glow faintly, as if reacting to their presence. Elliot's father ran his hand along the wall, feeling for any irregularities. His fingers brushed against a small crack, and he stopped. "There's something behind here, too," he said, grabbing the crowbar again. It took several minutes of prying, but eventually the wall crumbled away, revealing a hidden chamber. The air that rushed out was icy and foul, carrying with it an overwhelming sense of dread. Inside the chamber was a pile of old, tattered belongings, toys, clothing, and more crayon drawings. But what caught their attention most was a large, ornate mirror leaning against the far wall. The mirror's surface was cracked, its frame covered in strange carvings. As Sophia shone her flashlight on it, the reflection seemed to ripple, as though the glass were made of water. "That's not normal," she said, taking a cautious step back. Elliot stared at the mirror, mesmerized. He could see his reflection, but it was distorted. His face stretched and twisted. Behind him, the shadows in the room began to move. The shadows coalesced into the familiar forms of the strange family. The tall man, the wide grinning woman, and the eerie child. They stepped out of the darkness, their movements jerky and unnatural. Elliot's father stepped protectively in front of his family. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice shaking. The child giggled, tilting its head. "We don't want you," it said, its voice high and sing-song. "We want him." It pointed a long, bony finger at Elliot. Elliot's mother gasped, pulling him close. "You can't have him," she shouted. The tall man stepped forward, his hollow eyes locking onto Elliot's. "He belongs to us now," he rasped, "just like the others." Sophia grabbed one of the drawings from the pile in the chamber, holding it up. "Is this what ties you here?" she asked. "The drawings." The man's expression didn't change, but the woman let out a low, guttural growl. "Destroy them, and we'll destroy you," she hissed. Sophia's hands trembled, but she steeled herself. "We're not afraid of you." Sophia motioned for Elliot and his parents to grab as many drawings as they could carry. They raced upstairs, the ghostly family in pursuit. The shadows stretched along the walls, clawing at their heels as they scrambled into the living room. Elliot's father lit the fireplace, tossing in the first handful of drawings. The flames roared to life, their heat filling the room. The ghostly figures screamed, their forms flickering and distorting. "Keep going," Sophia shouted, feeding more drawings into the fire. Each one burned away with an eerie glow, and with it, the figures grew weaker. Finally, the last drawing was consumed by the flames. The ghostly family let out a final ear-splitting scream before collapsing into the shadows. The house trembled violently, then went still. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the crackling of the fire. "Is it over?" Elliot whispered. Sophia nodded, though her eyes remained wary. "I think so." The house felt different now, lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. But the family knew they could never truly forget what had happened. The walls held secrets too dark to erase completely, and the memories would linger like shadows in the corners of their minds. As they sat together in the living room, exhausted but relieved, Elliot looked up at the ceiling and whispered, "Thank you, Abigail." For the first time in weeks, the house was silent. The house seemed calm in the aftermath of burning the crayon drawings, but Sophia, Elliot, and his parents knew better than to trust the silence. It felt too deliberate, as though the strange family was regrouping, watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The unease in the air had not lifted entirely. It had only shifted, growing darker and heavier with each passing hour. Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that something worse was coming. His parents had tried to reassure him, but he could see the fear etched into their faces. Sophia, ever the realist, voiced what they were all thinking. "This isn't over." The first signs of trouble began shortly after nightfall. The temperature in the house plummeted, and the lights flickered, casting distorted shadows across the walls. Elliot's mother clutched his hand tightly, her knuckles white, while his father paced the living room, muttering about the electrical wiring. Sophia stood near the fireplace, her flashlight in hand, scanning the room for any signs of movement. "We destroyed the drawings," Elliot said, his voice trembling. "Why are they still here?" "Because it wasn't enough," Sophia replied grimly. "The drawings were part of it, but they weren't the source. There's something else holding them here. As if in response, a loud, rhythmic thudding echoed from deep within the walls. It started softly, like a heartbeat, then grew louder and more insistent. The sound reverberated through the house, shaking the floorboards and rattling the windows. Elliot's father grabbed a crowbar, his jaw clenched. "They're trying to scare us," he said, "but I'm not going to let them." Elliot's mother shot him a worried look. "What are you going to do?" "Find whatever's making that noise and end this," he said, his voice resolute. "Stay here." "No," Sophia interjected. "We're stronger together. If we split up, we're playing into their hands." Reluctantly, Elliot's father nodded. "Fine. But if things get too dangerous, we leave." The sound seemed to come from the basement, growing louder as they descended the creaking stairs. The air was damp and cold, carrying the smell of mildew and rot. The shadows danced wildly, flickering as their flashlights cut through the darkness. As they reached the bottom, the noise stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing in on them from all sides. "Where did it go?" Elliot whispered, clutching Sophia's arm. Sophia scanned the room, her flashlight beam settling on the cracked mirror they had found earlier. Its surface shimmered unnaturally, rippling like water. "It's the mirror," she said. "It's a portal or something. That's how they're connected to this place." Elliot's father stepped forward, raising the crowbar. "Then we destroy it." Before he could swing, the air grew heavy, and the shadows began to shift. The ghostly family emerged from the darkness, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. The tall man stepped forward, his movements stiff and deliberate. "You cannot destroy us," he said, his voice low and guttural. "This is our home." "No, it's not," Elliot's mother shouted, stepping protectively in front of her son. "You don't belong here." The woman with the wide grin let out a laugh, sharp and grating. "You cannot make us leave. This house is ours, and soon, so are you." The family lunged forward, their forms flickering and distorting as they moved. Sophia grabbed a bag of salt she had brought from the kitchen, throwing a handful at the advancing figures. The grains hit the tall man, causing him to recoil with an otherworldly screech. "It's working," she shouted. "Salt weakens them." Elliot's mother grabbed the bag, scattering salt across the room, while Sophia pulled Elliot toward the mirror. "We need to destroy this," she said. As they approached, the mirror's surface rippled violently, and a hand shot out from within. It was small and pale, the hand of a child. Elliot froze, his heart pounding as the ghostly child from the drawing stepped through the glass. It smiled at him, its teeth sharp and jagged. "Come with us, Elliot," it said sweetly. "We can be a family." "No," Elliot shouted, stepping back. "You're not my family." The child tilted its head, its expression darkening. "You'll regret that." Sophia grabbed the journal from her bag, flipping through the pages frantically. "There has to be something in here," she muttered. Her eyes landed on a passage about breaking spiritual connections. Salt, fire, and destruction of the object, binding the spirits to this world. "We need salt and fire," she said, looking at Elliot's father. "And we need to burn this mirror." Elliot's father nodded, grabbing a can of lighter fluid from the basement shelf. He doused the mirror's frame, careful to avoid the rippling surface, while Elliot's mother poured a line of salt around them to keep the ghostly family at bay. The figures grew more aggressive, clawing at the barrier of salt. The woman let out a blood-curdling scream, her wide grin stretching impossibly far. "You cannot destroy us," she shrieked. "Watch us," Sophia muttered. Elliot's father struck a match, tossing it onto the mirror. The frame erupted into flames, the fire licking at the edges of the glass. The ghostly child screamed, its form distorting as it tried to escape back into the mirror. As the mirror burned, the house began to shake violently. The walls groaned and cracked, and pieces of plaster fell from the ceiling. The ghostly family flickered like dying candles, their forms growing weaker and more transparent. But the tall man stepped forward one last time, his hollow eyes fixed on Elliot. "This isn't over," he rasped. "We'll find you again." "No, you won't," Sophia said, stepping between them. She grabbed the doll they had found in the attic, the one smeared with red crayon, and threw it into the fire. The doll ignited instantly, its plastic face melting as the flames consumed it. The tall man let out a final, ear-splitting scream before disintegrating into a cloud of smoke. The woman and child followed, their forms evaporating into the air. The mirror shattered with a deafening crack, and the house went still. The silence that followed was almost as unsettling as the chaos. The family stood together in the basement, breathing heavily, their faces pale and drawn. The mirror was nothing but shards of glass and ash, and the ghostly family was gone. "Is it over?" Elliot asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophia nodded, though her expression was cautious. "I think so." Elliot's father placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his grip firm. "We're never staying in this house again." They packed their belongings that same night, leaving the house behind. As they drove away, Elliot glanced back at the darkened windows. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow move, a faint flicker of motion. But when he blinked, it was gone. Months later, as the family settled into their new home, Elliot found an old box of crayons buried at the bottom of one of their moving boxes. He hesitated, his heart pounding as he opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper. The drawing was simple, almost childlike. It depicted a small house surrounded by trees. Beneath it, in jagged letters, were the words, "We'll be waiting." Elliot's hands trembled as he stared at the paper. He didn't tell anyone about it. He simply walked outside and threw it into the fire pit, watching as the flames consumed it. Even as the paper turned to ash, he couldn't shake the feeling that the family in the walls wasn't gone. Not entirely. The Warren family drove away from the house in silence, their breaths heavy and minds reeling from the night's events. The once familiar streets of their neighborhood passed by in a blur as they left their home behind. None of them looked back for long. There was an unspoken agreement that to do so might somehow invite the horrors back into their lives. Elliot sat in the back seat, his small hands gripping the edge of his seat. The image of the family in the walls was seared into his memory, their hollow eyes and twisted smiles haunting him every time he blinked. Next to him, Sophia was silent, staring out the window, her face pale but set with determination. Elliot's mother, sitting in the passenger seat, finally broke the silence. "Do you think it's really over?" Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "It has to be," Elliot's father replied, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "The mirror is gone. The drawings are gone. They're gone." Sophia glanced at him. "Maybe, but I don't think it's that simple. Spirits like that, they don't just disappear. They linger." Elliot's mother turned to Sophia, her brows furrowed. "What do you mean? You think they'll come back?" Sophia hesitated. I don't know. But if they do, at least we know what to do next time. Next time, Elliot muttered under his breath, his voice trembling. I don't want there to be a next time. The family moved into a small rental house on the other side of town. It was modest compared to their previous home, with outdated carpeting and creaky floors, but none of them cared about the aesthetics. What mattered was that it felt normal, blessedly, beautifully normal. There were no cold drafts, no shadows that stretched too far, and no whispers in the night. For the first few weeks, Elliot couldn't sleep in his own room. He insisted on sleeping on the couch in the living room, where he could see everyone. His parents didn't argue. They let him stay there, understanding that his fear wouldn't dissipate overnight. Sophia, meanwhile, delved deeper into the research she had started during their ordeal. She spent hours online, reading about hauntings, cursed objects, and the signs of lingering spirits. She kept a journal of everything they had experienced, determined to be prepared should they ever face something similar again. I don't think they're coming back, Sophia said one evening as she sat with Elliot at the kitchen table. But just in case, we'll always be ready. You're braver than you think, Elliot. Don't forget that. Elliot looked up at her, his small face serious. You think I was brave? Of course, Sophia said with a smile. You faced them. You didn't run away. That takes courage. Elliot nodded slowly, her words sinking in. He wasn't sure if he felt brave, but he wanted to believe her. Despite their best efforts to move on, the memories of the house lingered. Elliot often found himself thinking about the strange family and the events that had unfolded. He couldn't forget the hollow-eyed child's voice or the eerie smile of the woman. They felt etched into his mind, as permanent as the crayon drawings they had destroyed. One night, as Elliot lay in bed, he thought he heard a faint scratching sound. His heart raced, and he bolted upright, his eyes scanning the dark room. But there was nothing there, just the sound of his own breathing and the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He pulled the blanket over his head, clutching a small flashlight that Sophia had given him. It took hours for him to fall asleep. The family tried to find ways to heal together. They spent more time outdoors, going on hikes and having picnics in the park. Elliot's parents took him to counseling, hoping it would help him process the trauma. At first, Elliot was reluctant to talk about what had happened, afraid that no one would believe him. But as the weeks went by, he began to open up. I keep thinking about them, Elliot admitted during one session. The family. They said they were watching me. What if they still are? The counselor, a kind woman with warm eyes, leaned forward. It's normal to feel scared after what you've been through, Elliot. But remember, you took control of the situation. You stopped them. They have no power over you anymore. Elliot nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. Still, it felt good to talk about it. Sophia became something of an expert on paranormal phenomena. She joined online forums and even started a blog, sharing her experiences and offering advice to others who had encountered similar hauntings. Her posts attracted attention, and soon she was corresponding with people from all over the world. One evening, as she sat at her desk typing, she received a message from someone claiming to have lived in the Warren house decades earlier. The message was short, but chilling. I lived there in the 1970s. The family in the walls, they don't stop. They just wait. Sophia stared at the screen, her heart pounding. She didn't tell Elliot or his parents about the message, deciding it was better not to worry them. But she couldn't help wondering if the family in the walls was truly gone, or if they were simply biding their time. As the months passed, the Warrens began to feel a sense of normalcy again. Elliot started sleeping in his own room, though he kept the flashlight under his pillow. His drawings returned to being vibrant and happy, knights, dragons, and spaceships, with no sign of hollow-eyed figures or ominous messages. Sophia, too, found a sense of purpose in her research. She felt stronger, more capable, as though facing the ghostly family had taught her something important about herself. Elliot's parents, though still shaken by the experience, focused on creating a safe and happy environment for their children. They were more attentive, more present, and more willing to listen. The ordeal had brought them closer as a family, even if it had left scars. One rainy afternoon, as Elliot played with his crayons at the kitchen table, he noticed something strange. One of the crayons, a dull, faded red, looked old and out of place among the others. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. It felt heavier than it should, as though it carried some unseen weight. A chill ran down his spine. Slowly, he set the crayon down and pushed it to the edge of the table. He didn't tell anyone about it. He didn't need to. Deep down, he knew what it meant. The family in the walls was still out there, somewhere, waiting. But Elliot wasn't the same scared little boy he had been. He had faced them once, and he would face them again if he had to. For now, though, he chose to focus on the present, on the laughter of his parents, the encouragement of Sophia, and the bright, colorful drawings that filled his world once more. The house was behind them. The family was behind them. And for the first time in a long time, Elliot felt a glimmer of hope.